Thank you for joining me today for the devotional. The devotional today is based on the morning reading for April 30th in the Daily Prayer Guide, which can be found and downloaded on our website. And we're looking today at Ephesians 2, 11 through 18. Let me read those verses. Paul writes, "Therefore remember that at one time you Gentiles in the flesh, called the uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision, which is made in the flesh by hands, remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you once who were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one, and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing the law of commandments and ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in the place of two, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. And he came and preached peace to you who are far off, and peace to those who are near. For through him we both have access in one Spirit to the Father." So two main divisions here, as you probably picked up as I read that. The first part, the first two verses, are about what you Gentiles were. So he's addressing the non-Jews that are reading his letter. And then the last part, 13 through 18, is talking about what you are now. So he's contrasting what they were and what they are now in Christ. So what were they? Well, he says four things. He says you were separated from Christ. He says you were alienated from the commonwealth of Israel. He says you were strangers to the covenants, and you were hopeless and godless in the world. So they were a great distance away from God, separated totally from him. That's what they were before they embraced the gospel. But when they embrace the gospel, what are they then now by the blood of Christ? So what he says they are now is talking about their relationship to Gentiles with the Jews. You may know that the hostility between these two races was significant. Let me just read what William Barclay says about the hostility that existed between Jew and Gentile at the time of Jesus' ministry. He writes, "The Jew had an immense contempt for the Gentile. The Gentiles, said the Jews, were created by God to be fuel for the fires of hell. God, they said, loves only Israel of all the nations that he had made. It was not even lawful to render help to a Gentile mother in her hour of sorest need, for that would simply be to bring another Gentile into the world. Until Christ came, the Gentiles were an object of contempt to the Jews. The barrier between them was absolute. If a Jewish boy married a Gentile girl, or if a Jewish girl married a Gentile boy, the funeral of that Jewish boy or girl was carried out. Such contact with the Gentile was the equivalent of death." Tremendous hostility. But what we find here is that Paul teaches that hostility by the blood of the cross between Jew and Gentile has been eliminated. He says that it was killed at the cross, this hostility, in verse 16. And then he says peace was brought to the Jew and Gentile a couple different times in this passage. There is now no hostility. There is now peace between Jew and Gentile that Jesus Christ has brought through the gospel. So I think that just causes us, I hope, to ask the question, is what about us? Do we have hostility in our hearts or an absence of peace in any human relationship or any other person? We need to examine that. We need to ask our hearts. We need to ask our lives. Maybe even ask others if that hostility or lack of peace is evident in our attitude toward others. When I think of that, I think in the Gospels of another place, in Matthew's Gospel, where it talks about the unforgiving servant. It's the story of a servant who comes to his master, and he asks his master to forgive him his debt of the debt of 10,000 talents of gold. He had a debt of 10,000 talents. Now, 1 talent equaled 75 pounds. So that multiplied results in 750,000 pounds of gold he owed his master. That's equivalent in today's terms about $13 billion. Now, did this really this story, was this a truth story, or was this just an illustration? Well, because the absurdity of the debt, it's an illustration to point to the absurdity of God's forgiveness of us. Because his merciful master forgave him his debt. He forgave him. This debt of $13 billion was removed from the books. He no longer owed a debt to his master. And then the story in Matthew's Gospel takes us to this same servant who was forgiven this huge debt. And he encountered a fellow servant who owed him a debt of 100 denarii. Now, 1 denarii was equal to 1 day's wage. So he owed them, as we translate that into dollars today, a debt of about $6,000. Now, that's not a little bit of money. It's a fair debt. But in comparison to the $13 billion that was forgiven him by his master, was no comparison at all. So the servant who was forgiven would not forgive his fellow servant who owed him a debt of $6,000. It's an amazing response to something that was given to him that alleviated such a huge debt that he would not, in comparison, forgive a measly debt of $6,000. So this illustration of absurdity is to point to the absurd forgiveness that God has given us in Christ, who has forgiven us the spiritual debt of immeasurable worth, that we might know a redemption and forgiveness that is eternal, that is everlasting, that is life-changing. So this is what God has done for us. So it causes us to ask, can I remember that forgiveness when I think of human relationship? And based on the forgiveness I've received from the Lord, because of what Christ has done on the cross for me, then I have every means to forgive a fellow brother or sister of any kind of debt they owed me, because compared to the debt I owed the Lord and that he forgave is no comparison at all. Just to close, I just think of an illustration that was shared with me at a wedding conference I was at with my wife Cheryl. We were in Williamsburg, Virginia at this conference, and the speaker, Steve Brown, former pastor in our denomination and has done a lot of radio work as well, shared this story to illustrate the relationship between people, in this case between a man and a woman. And here's what he said. You may have heard this before. And it's been very helpful to me to think about the dividing wall of hostility that's been broken down in human relationship. He says that if you're playing poker with a dog, you don't criticize his game, you're just glad it's playing poker. If you're playing poker with a dog, you don't criticize his game, you're just glad it's playing poker. Well, his point, in this case in relationship to marriage, but it's applicable to every human relationship, is to say to realize a person that you are dealing with is a forgiven sinner. But it also begs you to realize that you yourself are a forgiven sinner. So he uses the illustration of a dog, that if I'm playing poker with a dog, I realize that I'm a dog as well. And if they are just someone who was a human being forgiven a huge debt, that I, in the same way, can give them that forgiveness that was given me. I'm a dog, and they're a dog. And if I understand that I'm on the same level with them, I'm no better than they are, and the sin that God's forgiven me is just as great as the sin he's forgiven them, then I can extend forgiveness and not criticism and ridicule. I can give them the same grace, the grace of forgiveness that Christ has given me. Perhaps these thoughts today might help and bless you as you think about what God has done for you in Christ in forgiving you, and the same forgiveness you are to extend your brothers and sisters in Christ. I pray this would be a great joy and delight to you as you think about these truths.